Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. A distinguished young physicist in the 1970s, Yuri Yarim-Agaev, was a graduate student at the Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, the Soviet Union's MIT, when he joined the dissident movement. In 1978, Yuri joined the Moscow Helsinki Group, the dissident organization that monitored Soviet compliance, or non-compliance, with the human rights provisions of the Helsinki Accords. His fellow members of the organization included the physicist Yuri Orlov and Yelena, the wife of Andrei Sakharov. Pronounce it for me, Yuri.
Sakharov, yes.
The first name, though.
Andrei Sakharov.
Andrei Sakharov. In 1980, well, we'll come to what happened in 1980. Now a financial analyst in New York, Yuri devotes a great deal of his time to ensuring that the lessons of Soviet communism are not forgotten. Yuri, welcome.
Thank you.
Yuri, the nature of communism. Two quotations. Historian Robert Conquest. The Soviet assumption that all other political life forms and beliefs were inherently and immutably hostile was the simple and central cause of the Cold War. Quotation number two, historian Robert Harris. If only it had been Trotsky who had succeeded Lenin and not Stalin, then the USSR might have been spared its famines and its terrors, its show trials and its denials of freedom. Close quote. Was communism inherently hostile, or was communism somehow a grand plan that Stalin hijacked?
Oh, it's absolutely essential to realize that it's inherently hostile, and I'm 100% with Bob Conquest, not only because he's a good friend of mine, but mainly because I completely agree with him. It's, well, there is empirical proof of that. We can look at all communist countries, and they're all the same, in a sense. I mean, in all major features, you wouldn't find much distinction between Soviet communism, Chinese communism, North Korean communism. Whenever communism was established in this world, it repeated all terrible features of communism. Stalin was only in one country, but there were other Ho Chi Minhs, Castros, and Mao Zedong, all the same. It's absolutely predetermined model. Now, one thing we should understand about totalitarian society is that it doesn't give much room for any interpretation. It's pretty much preset. So communism was first defined pretty strictly by Marx, then modified by Lenin, and in that form, actually, is implemented from one country to another with hardly any variations.
So I want to ask about the Russianness of Soviet communism. Daniel Pipes, quote, nowhere in the West has Marxism led to the totalitarian excesses of Leninism, Stalinism. In Russia, Marxism fell on a soil devoid of traditions of self-rule, law, and private property. So Daniel Pipes makes the point, he argues, it runs through all his work, that there's something distinctively Russian about Soviet communism. That Stalin is unthinkable if he hadn't been communist, but also very hard to suppose if he hadn't been drawing on Russian traditions of autocracy and so forth. Does that make sense to you?
No, I disagree with Richard Pipes about that.
Richard, I'm sorry, I misspoke. That's Richard. His son is Daniel. Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I disagree. What I can say that different countries may be susceptible to different extent to communism. So there is greater or lesser chance for communism to conquer this or that country. And say definitely United States or England with their traditions of democracy for many centuries has the strongest immunity to communism. Now, Russia didn't have such a strong immunity, as well as China and some other countries. But it would be illusion to think that if communism takes root in some of the society, it would have more benevolent form than it was in Russia. So it's a matter which country is more or less susceptible to this form of the government, but we shouldn't have any illusion that if that government, that system is established in any society. It would be as terrible as it was in the Soviet Union.
All right. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, speaking at Harvard in 1978, his famous commencement address at Harvard, quote, "Anguish about our divided world gave birth to the theory of convergence." That is to say, the Soviet Union and the West were growing more and more alike. "These worlds are not developing into similarity. If only you," this is Solzhenitsyn speaking to the faculty and faculty and students of Harvard, "if only you knew how the Moscow officials laugh at your political wizards," close quote. Solzhenitsyn was right?
Yes. He was 100% right, and this policy of convergence was pushed by Kremlin, and ironically, I would say it continues after the death of the Soviet communism for some strange reasons, and that's one of the most strange facts to me. After democratic capitalism so decisively defeated Soviet communism.
Oh, we won?
Yes, in that specific part of the
I want to come to that, but
war.
there are all kinds of people who say it just ended. Nobody won.
No.
All right. Go ahead.
It hasn't ended, and it was a real war between ideological war, but very important warfare between two opposite systems of both political and economic system. And what is amazing that after such a decisive victory of democracy and capitalism over communism, the lessons which were learned were very strange, and we, for some strange reason, still see some communist tendency developing inside our own country here.
Segment 2, Yuri and your own story as a dissident. As a young man, you represent the very flower of Soviet communism. You're a brilliant young scientist. You come of age some decades after the revolution. There's nothing of the old regime about you. You are a product of the modern Soviet state. And yet, when still in your 20s, you become a dissident. Why did you put that brilliant career at risk? Why did you turn against the system that had produced you?
Yeah, the answer to that was a sense of personal responsibility. Just because I felt that I became as early already as a part of that elite, which had maybe more information and understanding of what happened in the society, I felt more responsible for reacting to what I didn't like. And I didn't like a lot of things. I actually disagreed on principle with that system. But also I realized that I had maybe more immunity than many others because scientists in the Soviet Union had very high social status. And I had more immunity in terms that I could do more before being arrested or killed than many other people. So it was a suicidal mission in any case. And I'm saying it always that if you were not ready to die, you shouldn't have become dissident because you would have been broken by the KGB. They would sense it instantly. You know, if you are not ready to go to the very end, don't even try it.
Tell us about what happened in 1980. Tell me the story about when you discovered, the way in which you discovered that you were being shown the door.
Yeah, but let me tell you one thing before, which was important. The key to, I would say, success of this movement, two things were critical in securing our success. First, that we resolved totally to non-violent movement. We totally denied any violence. Second, that we operated absolutely open. We always would sign our names under any document, etc. Why is it important? Because there were attempts before dissidents to create some underground organization, etc., and even some armed organization. All of them were crushed instantly by the KGB because the secrecy and force was KGB turf when they were very strong. However, the openness and non-violence were the weakness of the communist system, and that's why we prevailed, actually, because here the KGB, look, it's like vampires in the daylight, you know. They became very weak when we started to do so openly. But, so we didn't conceal anything, and what happened with me, at one day I was full of 24 hours There were 2 cars usually following me. And at one day, I was pushed.
This was standard. When you made your way through Moscow, you were used to being followed.
Well, that's standard, but it's very few people. You can calculate simply resources which are required for that. They are enormous. So I was followed consistently for last 3 or 4 months. I was followed before also, often, but on more random basis. For last 3 months of my being in the Soviet Union, it was consistent 24 hours following. And at one day, several guys came, pushed me into one car, brought to the office of police, not of KGB, what was funny. But there were 2 top KGB officers in those cars, on the level of colonels. And there was conversation which was started by the head of this police office, who appeared to be totally uninformed, who I was and what I was doing, because he was given this funny role, to accuse me of some crimes, etc. And when the KGB, 2 KGB officers were sitting on the side, when they realized that he is incapable to carry out his funny assignment, they said, "We'll take care. From this moment, we'll do it." And he, the boss of this police office, he asked them, "Can I stay or should I leave?" They say, "Okay, you can stay, but shut up." And then it was very frankly. They gave me the paper, which was official warning, which actually accused me of my activities as Moscow Helsinki Group member, and my major crime was that I was actually the main person in the group who was in touch with American and British diplomats, and many of them were friends of mine. So I was.
This is true. They
absolutely.
There wasn't a fabricated charge.
And again, that I did absolutely openly also, right? And that absolutely it was true, and that was one of the way to me to convey our information, right. Etc. But by Soviet standards, it was high treason, actually. To be for ordinary Soviet citizen without official permission to get into contact with diplomats of such bad countries as America or England, it was simply high treason. So the warning was very clear. I mean, the criminal article which was mentioned in this warning was Article 64, which was high treason, which assumed capital punishment. And they told me, "Look, that's what we can do and we may do, but we give you alternative, you may leave the country. If you leave the country within months before Summer Olympic Games would start in Moscow, they didn't want me to stay until it was 1980.
They didn't want you demonstrating in front of Western cameras.
Yeah, and also to be in touch with many important people who would come. We would let you go." I say, "Wait a second, but I never applied for any immigration. I didn't intend." They told, "Don't worry. I mean, you will leave whenever you decide to do so." Now, why it happened, it's important, because there was already a strong campaign on my behalf, which was started by American scientists. Andrei Sakharov was already exiled to Gorky at that time. Yuri Orlov was
internal exile.
Internal exile, exactly.
Right.
Yuri Orlov was already arrested and was in labor camp. Anatoly Sharansky, my good friend, who was also a scientist, was also arrested. It created very strong and successful campaign in America, which was actually organized here in Bay Area by my good friends who worked at that time at Berkeley lab. They created an organization which was called Sakharov Orlov Sharansky in defense of scientists. They couldn't do much at that time about Sakharov Sharansky because they were already arrested.
Right.
But it helped a lot me and several other scientists who were on the verge of arrest, because it was easier to prevent person to be arrested than to get out. Eventually, as you know, Orlov and Sharansky were released. So that's how I was exiled.
Segment 3, how to fight a Cold War. You've drawn up a list. You mentioned this a moment ago, but I want to go through it. You've drawn up a list of the rules or principles that informed the dissident movement in the Soviet Union. Let's go through a few of these. Nonviolent resistance to a violent regime. Why not engage in acts of sabotage? Why not be like the IRS in Northern Ireland?
Well, first of all, if you ask me personally, I disagree on it on moral and principle grounds, but if you ask as a practical question, which is very important, the answer is very simple. Because the violence is strength of the KGB and the Soviet communism. You actually would always lose if you use their weapon. Look, we were talking about superpower which had more arms than the United States of America. I mean, it's very naive to think that you can, with several shotguns or I don't know pistols, you can fight against the country with hundreds of thousands of nuclear missiles. So that's important, but never, if you have very strong opponent, never try to compete with this opponent on its territory. Try to choose what is really weak.
Human rights. Human rights is the primary concern and uniting principle.
Absolutely. That's a death blow, because what communism is about is total denial of human rights. It cannot afford any human rights. I mean, it cannot afford any political and civil rights. Let's say that communism always claims that it provides to people social, economic rights, but it totally denies political and civil rights. That's a death blow for communism, and and it totally undermines legitimacy of the communist system. When you start to hold it accountable on that matter, it has nothing to say and defend.
So here's what, you read Lenin and you read Trotsky, you read all the founding revolutionaries, and over and over again they're talking about inventing a new kind of human being, the new Soviet man, the entirely new set of values. So there are two puzzles here for me. One is, where did Yuri and Sakharov and Sharansky, where did you get your notion of human rights? Was it to some extent religious? Are you read it? What are you? Where do you pick up the principles of human rights? And then the second is, it seems to me that by arguing human rights, your premise is that there's something even in the KGB, you are touching something within them.
Yes. That
at some level they know you're right.
Absolutely. And that's actually was our main force, that we actually that helped to corrupt this whole system on the top. And when you look into some memoirs which were written after 91 by some top Soviet official, particularly by Alexander Yakovlev, he recognizes in his writing how important was reading of our documents and our statements by the top leaders of Communist Party and even KGB. We spoiled them. Now, how we learned about human rights? Well, Peter, the answer number one is, I believe it's very natural thing. It's kind of comes with us naturally for human beings, so the idea of human rights.
Natural law. You're a believer in that?
Pretty much so. But also we were quite educated people. And even in the absence of many things which were published officially in the Soviet Union, you could still read a lot of things from which we were very well read on Western civilization, so we knew and understood many things. So it wasn't that we were totally isolated from any information.
Here's another one of your principles or rules: moral resistance. Moral resistance. High principles of ethics and honor. Now, this is another puzzle for me, because you've already explained that the core, or at least one of the most important elements of the dissident movement, was made up of scientists.
Yes.
And in this country, academics tend to stay away from the categories of moral imperatives.
Right.
And you're embracing them.
Absolutely.
You're saying right and wrong matter.
Absolutely. You cannot be dissident without moral imperative. As I told you in the beginning, if you are not ready to die for standing for being dissident, you will be broken. Your only weapon is resolve. You cannot get such resolve. And KGB knew and felt it well enough, to diagnose, who is who and how strong you are, and if you are not strong enough, you will be broken.
In some perverse way, the KGB was good at what they did.
Well, yes. Yeah. They knew. In that perverse way, they were actually. They would test everyone, but they would feel, if they feel that the person is strong, they wouldn't actually even try to tell. They could imprison him. They would imprison most of such people because they had to, but they would realize that they cannot break this person. Now, what can give you such resolve if not moral imperative? What can give you readiness to die for that cause if not a moral imperative? Well, scientists can also have moral, that's a discovery which you can learn from dissidence community in the Soviet Union. But we realize, but you maybe have to live through communism, which totally denies the whole concept of good and evil, to realize how those things are important for human being and for human society.
Yuri, was it an evil empire?
Absolutely.
Segment 4, how it ended. Within months of becoming General Secretary, Gorbachev begins speaking of perestroika, reform, restructuring. He seems to have believed that he could somehow create a communist party that was in some way or another open to democracy. You could run various candidates within the party for positions. He seems to have believed that he could have had some sort of opening to free markets and made the economy more efficient, and that all of this would have been consistent in some way with communism. Was he onto something or naive from the very beginning?
Well, it wasn't naivete. It was an inevitable situation. Let's say, first of all, very clearly, that the only goal which Gorbachev had was to save communism. That was his only purpose. Now, let's also remember that Gorbachev was not kind of a reformer different from all other top communists. He was nominated unanimously by Politburo to the position of first secretary, and he actually received mandate for making reforms, because everyone realized on the top of communist government that they must make those reforms, that communism...
Something had to give.
Yeah, absolutely. Communism couldn't simply survive, without reform. So those reforms made by Gorbachev were not caused by his love to freedom or any human rights, but by sheer necessity to save communist system. Now, it was impossible already to save it. So it's you can say that he was naive, but he actually tried to do whatever was possible to do, and the system was doomed to collapse as it did. So his power was very limited,
1953, the Soviets crushed the East German workers' uprising. Right. 1956, tanks roll into Budapest and crush the Hungarian Revolution. 1968, tanks roll into Prague. Prague Spring blotted out. 1989, Gorbachev visits East Berlin and says to Honecker, "You're on your own. I will not put down this movement." And Gorbachev permits the wall to fall and the so-called Velvet Revolutions to sweep across Eastern Europe. Why?
Why? Because
he's a better human being than his predecessors?
No, not at all. Look, I actually never met Gorbachev, and I don't care actually about his personality, because it's actually irrelevant. Now, I get for one moment to the beginning of our conversation when we talked whether there exist different forms of communism, some more malignant, some more benevolent. And I say no. The communism is predetermined form. It actually repeats itself in the same sense. However, it has different stages of development. And you also can observe it in any communist society. It starts with very young ideology, which is very strong because it's young. It actually conquers a lot of talents in the society. It establishes itself very strong. And at the first stage after it is established, it's very difficult to do something with that because it really has some support and some roots in the society. And one of the reasons of failure of the Bay of Pigs operation by United States was exactly the timing, because this ideology at that moment was very fresh and strong in Cuba.
The Cubans still supported, at some level, in some way, they supported Fidel. They were for the revolution.
Yes. However, this ideology goes through several stages and it becomes weaker and weaker. it fails to recruit talents and strong people from the society, and that's what was admitted by KGB itself. And one of interrogation of my friend, the KGB colonel, said to him, if we only had such people as you dissidents in our ranks. So they admitted that many good people now started to go to dissidents rather than to KGB or to Central Committee. But overall, the ideology becomes weaker and weaker. So when you mention those dates with Berlin, with Hungary, with Czechoslovakia, etc., at that time, ideology was still strong enough. But when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, I remember, my word was that that's the end of the Soviet Union. That's already
You
was...
knew it. That's
absolute.
79. You're
Absolute.
still inside the Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
You knew at that moment
I knew that
it was an overreach.
Yes, that was overreach, that it was adventure,
Yuri.
which didn't have root and support in that country any longer. That was the beginning of the end of communism in the Soviet Union.
There are different theories, different ways of explaining the collapse of the Soviet Union. One is imperial overreach. It just fell in on itself. Another, Christopher Hitchens on this program has said that the dissidents did it. He places great emphasis on the dissident movement in Eastern Europe. He was a good friend of Václav Havel. And Christopher Hitchens has gone so far as to say that the United States, and in particular Ronald Reagan, were virtually irrelevant. It would have happened as it happened if Ronald Reagan had never been born. So my question is, what was the role of the United States from zero to negative? There are those who say that Ronald Reagan's military buildup prolonged the Cold War to having some effect.
Well, 100% positive, and let me tell you that I think there are three major forces which were responsible for the collapse of communism. It's inherent problem and contradiction of the system itself was force number one. I mean, that was very important. Dissident movement was also important. Look, I am a little bit impartial in this sense, but I still believe that we played important role inside. Ronald Reagan's policy was absolutely critical and important. So I think the combination of those three things was the most fortunate thing at the moment. Because we were not talking about the fact that communism collapsed. We were talking about the fact how smoothly and peacefully it collapsed.
Yes.
And
what about John Paul II? What about that visit
no,
to Poland?
absolutely. I usually mention three names: Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and John Paul II. That was a triad, which was, again, it was maybe like a coincidence, maybe something, but all things came together at that moment. So that triad on the Western side, on the side of Western democracy, was absolutely critical and important.
Segment 5, Why It Matters. About a year ago, you and I had lunch together, and you said a couple of things that I found so striking, I went back and made notes. And here's what you said. This is you speaking to me about a year ago. The other day, you said, I got a call from a friend who teaches at Berkeley. He'd been talking with a grad student about developments in physics during the Cold War, and the grad student said, the Cold War, what was that? And then you continued, Yuri, and said, Yuri, I was in my 20s when I joined the dissident movement, and you, me, were in your 20s when you entered the Reagan White House. That makes us members of the last cohort. We're the last ones who remember. How can we tell the story? Why does it matter? What harm would come to them if our children forgot all about it?
Well, I'll give you several reasons. One is very simple, the most straightforward, because communism still exists, and exists in very derived forms. There are still communist countries in this world, and the most apparent is North Korea, but Vietnam, but China also remains communist country with, let's not have illusions about that. So we do face, the Cold War is not completely over as long as we still have direct presence of communism. Now, it still is present in countries which are post-communist countries and which also spoils a lot of things in our foreign policy, like Russia. Russia is not communist country any longer, but the main communist structure, which is KGB, is still in power there, and it doesn't help us in our foreign policy in many aspects. But there is another thing which is very important. The communism was not simply part of Russian history. The communism gave us the best example and the most clear example of totalitarian society, in which idea of the big government was developed to its ultimate form, to its extreme. Also, during that time, the communism made us focus our minds to such extent that we understood so many important things about such totalitarian societies. Now, it's applicable to anything, including ourselves. And there are some trends into direction of big government, even in our country, as we can see, right? If we are not arrogant and snobbish enough to say that what happened in the Soviet Union relates only to Russians and have no possible implication to us, but if instead we become wise enough and start to learn, on the experience of Soviet communism, what those trends are, where can they bring us, etc., it would save us many possible errors even in our domestic policy. So what I'm saying, experience of communism is important in our foreign policy when we deal not only with communism but with many other totalitarian societies like Iran, for example. Mm-hmm. But lessons from communism would also be important to avoid many pitfalls and errors in our domestic policy.
Now, how far do you want to take that? Are you suggesting that the experience in the Soviet Union ought to suggest to us that national health care is a terrible mistake?
Absolutely.
You are?
Sure.
So what you're saying is be very careful of middle ground, be very careful of encroachments, of enlargements of government that by Soviet standards would look modest.
Right.
We always have to push in the direction of individual liberty, of individual freedom. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. What I am saying is that there are two extreme points which we should remember. There are, and I can juxtapose them, and I actually made a list for myself for big government society, which ultimate form is totalitarian society, and free society. And we can look in different areas of our life. What is starting point? I mean, we don't have absolutely free society. We always make some compromises. But the starting point for totalitarian society and free society are totally different. And we should always remember what our starting point. Even in such most essential issue as freedom and security. Mm-hmm. Let's state these two fundamental things, which actually contradict each other. We realize that whenever we involve more security, we sacrifice some part of freedom. And it's inevitable to some extent. We realize it. But we should still remember that in free society, we start with ultimate freedom, right, and give away very small pieces of that freedom only whenever it's totally necessary to have more security. In totalitarian society, we start with the opposite end. Absolute security, zero freedom. And when the totalitarian government is pushed very hard, it may give very small piece of freedom, in exchange of... That's very important framework to me. And I think we can learn from communism a lot because it provides some ideal pure case, of this big government.
Right.
Independent, whether it was Russia, what years it was. It gives us exact scientific model from which we can learn a lot.
Yuri, unfortunately, we're almost out of time. Students graduating from Cal Berkeley or MIT, you've worked at both institutions in this country, have no memory of the Cold War. They were born after Ronald Reagan left office. The Soviet Union went out of existence officially in December 1990. They have no memory at all. In one sentence, what do they need to know?
Well, they need to know fundamental principles of totalitarian society, and they need to know how Cold War was won by democratic world. And I believe it's our failure to some extent, but it's still recoverable that they don't know. We were the last people who carry this torch, and we should make sure that it's passed to next generation. And there were too many forces, Peter, who didn't want and don't want it to happen. You know, first of all, there was still strong forces of former communist governments, but it was also the left in democratic world, in this country, which didn't want to be seen on the wrong side of history. So all of them together said, let's forget about all of that. It's irrelevant any longer. We don't need it.
Here's my last question. How do you answer the following assertion? And I will now quote what Mikhail Gorbachev said when he visited Stanford University in 1990. The Cold War has been left behind, and it's not worth squabbling over who won.
Yes, because it's not in his interest. But why do we oblige him and say, look, Nazism ended 50 years earlier than communism. We still remember Nazism. It's a lot of books written, a lot of movies. Look, still now we have
we all understand instinctively that that's a vital lesson, that students have to understand what Hitler did.
The same with communism.
All right. Yuri Yarim-Agaev, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.